Hello everyone, welcome back to History 2001, Launching America. In this video, we will continue our discussion of the American Revolutionary War by talking about the fighting in the southern colonies and on the western frontier, leading up to the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. We'll also discuss the conclusion of the war as well, and its effects on both American and world history. As you know from our last video, the American Revolutionary War had reached a stalemate in the northern colonies. The British held some of the major population centers, but they could not successfully occupy the colony's Patriot interior. The colonists had declared their independence in 1776, so simply outlasting the rebellious Patriots by occupying the coast was no longer an option. To avoid this impasse and win the war, the British High Command resolved to open a new theater of operations in America, specifically in the southern colonies. This new campaign would concentrate on the South. Specifically, Britain's southern strategy would focus on Georgia and South Carolina. The British landed their troops in Savannah in December of 1778. The British theorized that newer colonies, especially Georgia, would have a higher Loyalist population, which would assist the British Army in defeating the Patriots to the north. The British could also receive reinforcement from their military assets in East Florida, which they had gained from Spain in 1763 after the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War. The British gained some support from the Loyalists in Georgia after their capture of Savannah, but the Loyalists were far more interested in staying home on their farms and plantations and making sure their slaves did not use the chaos of war as a chance to escape or rebel. We will talk more about the role that African Americans played in the Revolutionary War in a moment. The British Army's failure to gain major Loyalist support in Georgia led Britain to invade the Carolinas in May of 1780. The British captured Charleston, and the city, fearing a slave uprising, quickly submitted to British occupation as the Patriot forces retreated into the interior. The British Army took a harder line against the Patriots in the Carolinas, forcing militiamen who had surrendered to actually join Loyalist units, where they would have to fight against their former comrades. They also confiscated Patriot property, including slaves. Slaves of Patriot masters were allowed to join the British Army and receive freedom after their service. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the British military's policy of arming black men to fight in its ranks and encouraging slaves to flee their masters and come into the British lines. And I want to talk a little bit more about the British efforts to recruit African American slaves, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about why the British did this and how they did this recruitment of African Americans. So I'll start by saying in 1775, the British governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, he wanted to recruit slaves of Patriot masters, offering them freedom in exchange for military service in the British military. And this plan was done out of military expediency. The idea was offering the slaves of Patriot masters freedom through military service would cause slave owners of all political perspectives to submit to Britain. This would keep slave owners from declaring they were patriots, otherwise they might lose their slaves. It would also keep neutral slave owners from going over to the Patriot side for fear of losing their slaves. And it would also galvanize Loyalist slave owners who would not lose their slaves. Remember, only slaves of Patriots could join the British military in this fashion. So it's not being done out of a abolitionist or emancipationist desire. It's being done out of military expediency. Dunmore's proclamation will be expanded in 1779 by Sir Henry Clinton's Phillipsburg Proclamation, which gave freedom to all slaves who escaped from Patriot masters, regardless of whether they served in the British military. So this would allow slaves to escape from Patriot masters, and those that either were unable or had no desire to join the British military would now have freedom as well in the British lines. Some things to think about: the plight of black soldiers who joined the British military. Many of them were treated poorly. They served in segregated units, commanded by white officers. Some black people who had belonged to Loyalist masters, they were actually forced to go back to slavery. They'd be sent back. Other black slaves in the British Army would not be returned to Patriot masters. Instead, they might be resold in other parts of the British Empire. This often happened after the war. Although in other cases, the British made good on their promise to these African American people who had fought on the British side and resettled them as free people in other parts of the British Empire, in places like Canada or even in Africa. I also want to mention that the Patriots would recruit black men for their armies as well. Some slaves were recruited. Usually these slaves were fighting alongside their Patriot owners or masters. And there's also a lot of free black men who will fight in the Patriot army, particularly in New England. And again, I wanted to go into detail discussing the British plans to recruit African Americans because, as I said, there's often misunderstanding about why and how the British recruited black men to fight in their armies. A lot of people erroneously think that the British were an anti-slavery power, and certainly there were many anti-slavery measures taken by the British Empire. The British Empire abolished slavery 30 years before the United States did, for example. But during the American Revolutionary War, it would be incorrect to say that the British were a abolitionist, emancipationist power the way that, say, the Union was during the American Civil War. And now we'll discuss African Americans who fought on the Patriot side in the American Revolutionary War. I also want to discuss African Americans in the Patriot armed forces. African Americans fought in the U.S. armed forces since the beginning of this nation, including in the American Revolutionary War. The first black military unit was created in Rhode Island. You can see them on the left-hand side of this slide. You can also see a soldier from this unit here on the right-hand side. This is a illustration drawn by a French military officer who was at the Battle of Yorktown. So many of the men in this original unit, founded in 1775, were still fighting in 1781. African Americans, both free and slave, fought for the Patriots in the South as well. And many of these black men who were slaves, they fought alongside their masters during the war. And many of them received freedom in exchange for their military service. Black men fought in their own units, but in some cases they fought alongside white soldiers as well. Something that's not going to be common again in the U.S. military until after World War II, when the U.S. military is going to be fully desegregated. In the end, about 5,000 to 8,000 African Americans will fight for the Patriots, and over 10,000, however, will fight for the British, with about another 10,000 African Americans fleeing to the British lines during the American Revolutionary War in exchange for freedom. And remember, not all African Americans that fled to the British lines received freedom in the end. Those that had been property of Loyalist masters might be returned to their Loyalist masters. In some cases, the British did not keep their promise of giving freedom to former slaves of Patriot masters. Sometimes those escaped slaves would be resold in other parts of the British Empire. But in other cases, the British government did make good on its promises and gave freedom to the escaped African American slaves who came to their lines. They received freedom. In the South, the Continental Army and the Patriot militias fought both against British regulars as well as militias made up of Loyalist colonists. Both factions fought each other in pitched battles, but the nature of the fighting in the Carolinas was much more chaotic, in some places devolving into violent civil war, as small communities fought each other over their political alignment, but also over long-standing disagreements that predated the war. The partisan nature of the fighting made the war in the Carolinas very acrimonious. One side would attack another, and the other faction would respond with a reprisal attack. Both the Patriots and the Loyalists disregarded the delineation between enemy fighters and non-combatants as well. On one particularly bloody occasion, Banastre Tarleton, the British commander of a Loyalist cavalry regiment, saw his dragoons kill over 100 Patriot militiamen who were in the process of surrendering. Although Tarleton denied any wrongdoing for his failure to stop the killing of the would-be prisoners of war, he earned the nickname Bloody Ban, or Ban the Butcher, from the Patriots. On an unrelated note, Tarleton's family was heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade, and Tarleton himself fought against the abolition of slavery in the British Empire as a member of Parliament in the early 1800s. Now I want to talk about Francis Marion, better known as the Swamp Fox. Marion was a Patriot militia / ranger colonel from South Carolina. And in many ways, he's kind of the foil to the British Lord Tarleton, the Loyalist cavalry commander. The British tend to dislike Marion in a lot of the same way that Americans tend to dislike Tarleton, and you'll see why in a moment. As a young man, Marion acquired military experience fighting against Native Americans in the French and Indian War. He also fought alongside Native Americans that were on the British and American side in that conflict as well. Marion also worked as a sailor as a young man as well and was actually shipwrecked, so he had a lot of interesting life experiences as a young man. We should also note that Marion came from a fairly wealthy planter family in South Carolina. His family owned a couple hundred slaves, and Marion himself owned slaves as well. During the Revolutionary War, Marion would avoid engaging the British forces and the Loyalist forces aligned with the British in open battle. Instead, he would harass British troops and Loyalist troops and then retreat into the swamps. He would also strike at Loyalist settlements and would make, in some cases, very harsh reprisals against Loyalists or Tories in South Carolina. Interestingly, when Marion received orders to confiscate Loyalist slaves, these Loyalist slaves or slaves of Loyalist masters would be sold or given to American Patriot soldiers as payment, since the state of South Carolina didn't have enough money to pay them. It appears that Marion disliked that order and did not follow it, and he and his troops continued to receive no pay. Additionally, Marion had been ordered to execute captured Loyalist slaves or captured Patriot slaves that were acting as spies. It appears that Marion did not follow that order, that he opposed it. So in some ways, Marion could be very harsh towards Loyalists and towards the British, but he did have his limits. He had reservations about enslaving slaves of Loyalist masters, and he had reservations about executing slaves accused of being spies. Marion also disliked commanders in the American Continental Army, including General Horatio Gates. And it appears that Gates did not really like Marion very much either. In fact, Gates did not use Marion's troops during the Battle of Camden. It's possible that if Marion and his troops had fought at the Battle of Camden, the battle would not have been such a disastrous defeat for the Patriots as it was. In the end, though, I would say that Marion was a very successful commander in the Revolutionary War. His actions and his reprisals against Tory colonists really helped to keep the British from gaining too much support in South Carolina, the support they would have needed to be successful in the region and to separate it from the Patriots. There's also a very interesting story about Marion and his time with the Rangers and militia during the Revolutionary War. A British officer met with Marion to arrange a prisoner exchange, and he went to Marion's camp and observed the harsh conditions in which Marion and his troops lived. They had no uniforms, they had to provide all their own equipment, even their own rations. Marion offered the British officer a simple meal of sweet potatoes and water, and the British officer, instead of being encouraged by the poverty of Marion's troops, he was dismayed to see these men fighting with so little support, but fighting so aggressively and so passionately against the British. As was often the case in the North, the Continental Army and the Patriot militias struggled to fight the British regulars in open battle. At the Battle of Camden in northern South Carolina on August 16, 1780, General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, was defeated by the British Army under command of General Charles Cornwallis. Cornwallis, who was actually outnumbered 2-1, having about 2,100 troops, defeated a 4,000-strong American force. Cornwallis routed the Americans, killing or wounding about 900 and capturing about 1,000 of them. The British sustained fewer than 300 casualties. Gates, the American commander, had taken a strategy that was too bold, and he did not play to the militia's strengths, who broke and ran under heavy fire from the smaller but more disciplined British line. Britain's victory at Camden opened up North Carolina for British invasion. Although Camden was a British triumph, the greatest victory that Britain saw in the South, their forces were unable to follow up on their success. North Carolina had a smaller Loyalist population than either South Carolina or Georgia, and Patriot strength increased the further northward the British marched. Additionally, Patriot militia attacked Cornwallis's Loyalist flank and routed the Tories, remember, that's another term for Loyalists, at the Battle of Kings Mountain on October 7, 1780. The enraged Patriots, spurred on by the battle cry, "Remember Tarleton's quarter," charged the Loyalists and defeated them. The Patriots then held a drumhead trial, a type of hasty military court in which they sentenced 9 Loyalist prisoners to death for their role, or alleged role, in the killing of the Patriots under Tarleton. Kings Mountain and its ferocity was emblematic of the American Revolutionary War in the South. Patriot militiamen fought their own countrymen with more ferocity than they did the British regulars, seeing the battle as an opportunity for revenge. It really was a civil war in the South, and a foretelling of events to come, although participants in the Revolutionary War could not have realized this. Hoping to build on the victory at Kings Mountain, the American Southern commander, Nathaniel Greene, whom George Washington had put in charge of the South after Gates's defeat, adopted an aggressive strategy against Cornwallis. Greene divided his own force and organized a series of attacks to harass Cornwallis's troops. In one such attack, Daniel Morgan's Patriot militiamen sought revenge on Tarleton and his Loyalists at the Battle of Cowpens on January 17, 1781. They were so successful that they effectively destroyed the British commander's Loyalist brigade. Tarleton's militia played to its strengths, sniping at the Loyalists from cover, and then killing or wounding over 300 of them, and then capturing 600 more. Without his Loyalist cavalry, Cornwallis had lost his scouts and the critical intelligence they provided, making his army much slower and more cautious. With the defeat of the Loyalists at Capens, Greene attacked the main British force at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse on March 15th of 1781. As was the case at Camden, the Patriots outnumbered the British 4,500 to 2,100, over 2 to 1. The militia was not the reason that the Americans lost the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, though. Rather, General Cornwallis made excellent use of his cannons, firing grape shot, an artillery round that works like a giant shotgun shell to disperse the American attacks on his position. The battle was a tactical victory for the British, who drove the larger American force from the field, but it was ultimately a strategic defeat, as Cornwallis could not pursue the retreating Patriots due to a lack of supplies and a lack of scouts, as discussed before. Consequently, Cornwallis made a retrograde, a military term for retreat, back to the North Carolina coast, leaving the Patriots in control of all the Carolinas in Georgia, except for the coastal cities. Cornwallis instead planned an invasion of Virginia. Benedict Arnold, the American trader who was now fighting for the British, had already made a raid on Richmond, Virginia's capital, back in January, so Virginia seemed like the most logical place for another assault on the colonies. Before we talk about the British campaign in Virginia, where the major fighting of the American Revolutionary War ended, we should discuss how the conflict was fought on the western frontier. You all had a taste of how the frontier war worked in our discussion of the Saratoga campaign in our previous video, but now we will discuss fighting on the western borderlands in more detail. In the West, Britain's greatest ally was not Loyalist colonists, as was the case east of the Appalachian Mountains. Rather, Native Americans were the most important allies the British could have, although not all tribes sided with the British. Some tribes sided with the Patriots, but most preferred to remain neutral, seeing the war between the British and the Americans as a family quarrel into which they should not become involved. Some Native American groups, like the Cherokee in the South, split into factions, with some siding with the British and others with the Patriots. In the North, the Six-Nation Iroquois Confederacy was divided as well, with the Cayuga, Mohawk, and Seneca backing the British, and the Oneida and Tuscarora siding with the Patriots. The Onondaga were mostly neutral. It's also worth noting that the Stockbridge Indians of Massachusetts sided with the Patriots, and did so from the beginning of the war in 1775. In western Pennsylvania and the Ohio River Valley, encompassing present-day Kentucky and West Virginia, as well as parts of Pennsylvania and Indiana and Illinois, the British and their local Indian allies engaged the Patriot frontiersmen and militia. Whichever faction controlled the Ohio River would have access to the Mississippi River, a key water supply and transit route. Frontiersmen like Daniel Boone rose to prominence during the American Revolutionary War, fighting Native Americans that had allied themselves with Britain, primarily the Shawnee. Frontiersmen like Boone had violated the Proclamation line of 1763, settling beyond the Appalachian Mountains, and they were determined to defend their illicit settlements in Indian country. The fighting on the frontier was fierce, even more so than in the South. An early engagement, the Battle of Wyoming, fought on July 3, 1778, saw a Loyalist militia of about 100 men, with over 400 Seneca allies, attack and defeat a Patriot force of about 360. 340 of the Patriots were killed, with the Seneca collecting over 200 scalps. Patriot eyewitnesses claim that the Seneca captured and tortured some of the Patriot prisoners to death, a common ritual amongst the Eastern Woodlands peoples, as discussed in a previous video. The eyewitnesses also claimed, more dubiously, that the Seneca had killed non-combatants, including women and children. The British commander at Wyoming, John Butler, denied the attacks against the civilians, although he confirmed that the Seneca showed no mercy to the militiamen, killing every soldier they came across. Butler said that the Seneca took only 5 militiamen alive, although he never stated what happened to these prisoners. Events in New York also encouraged the Patriots to take a harder stance against Native Americans that were allied with the British. The killing of Jane McCrae in 1777 during the Saratoga Campaign and the Cherry Valley Massacre of November 11, 1778, in which Indians and Loyalists attacked a Patriot community in New York, caused this change in increased aggression against Native Americans. At Cherry Valley, the Seneca actually killed Patriot civilians. In response to these attacks, as well as the death of Jane McCrae, the Patriots made reprisals on British allied Native American settlements, burning villages to the ground in Pennsylvania. The destruction of the militiamen in Wyoming and the killing of civilians in New York inspired General George Washington to order a punitive attack on British allied Iroquois territory in upstate New York in the summer of 1779. Washington ordered the expedition's commander, Colonel John Sullivan, to destroy all British allied Iroquois power by any means necessary and to clear the area of all hostile Native Americans. Although Sullivan and his men quickly focused on removing all Native Americans, regardless of their allegiance. Sullivan's expedition saw intense violence against British allied Native Americans in upstate New York. And as I said, other Native Americans became caught up in his attacks as well. Sullivan's army destroyed about 40 Iroquois villages, forcing the survivors to flee northward to Canada. There were also reports of violence by Continental and militia soldiers against Iroquois non-combatants, and of soldiers mutilating the bodies of Indians they had killed. Sullivan's march was a resounding tactical success for the Continental Army. It neutralized the power of the British allied Iroquois nations and opened upstate New York for increased white settlement. The campaign also earned Washington the nickname Town Destroyer from aggrieved Indians. Sullivan's march forced thousands of Iroquois from their ancestral homelands, with countless more dying from disease, exposure, and starvation as a result of losing their homes. Some scholars classify Sullivan's march as an act of ethnic cleansing, in which one group forcibly removes another from its homeland. Some even refer to Sullivan's march as an act of genocide. No matter the terminology that is used, Sullivan's march, with its ferocity, did have historical precedent. The colonial militias, in their wars against Native Americans, had targeted for destruction Native American villages and saw this punitive strategy as essential to their tactics, as the destruction of villages would compel Indian foes to cease fighting and give up their land, due to a loss of their winter supplies. The Patriots used this strategy during the Revolutionary War, learning from the wars in colonial America, and the U.S. military would use this same approach in later conflicts. Further to the west, the fighting between Patriots, the British, and Native Americans was also severe and acrimonious. Each faction targeted the other's settlements, and the British, in particular, offered compensation to Native Americans who would attack Patriot settlements. All the while, additional white settlers, mostly Patriots from Virginia, moved westward along the Ohio River Valley into Kentucky and the Ohio Country, settling on land left behind by both Native Americans and frontiersmen. In the Ohio Country, a multinational task force, including Patriot soldiers, French-Canadian militia, and some Native Americans, led by George Rogers Clark, defeated the British Army and its own Native American and Loyalist allies, bringing the contested region under Patriot control in July of 1778, after the capture of British Fort Vincennes. Early in the war, French Canadians had been reticent to support the Patriot cause, but France's entrance into the war on the American side convinced many to side with the independence-minded colonists against the British. The Americans and their allies would fail to capture Detroit, then a major British fort, but the British also failed to recapture the Ohio Country and what will become the state of Kentucky. The violence of the war in the Ohio River Valley led participants to call the region, especially Kentucky, the dark and bloody ground. With the Ohio River in American hands, the Patriots could now haul supplies up the Mississippi and Ohio rivers to Pittsburgh from New Orleans, skirting the British blockade of their Atlantic ports. This became even easier after Spain entered the war in favor of the Patriots in 1779. The Spanish sold the Patriots discounted supplies, allowing them to skirt the British naval blockade. The Spanish governor of Louisiana, Bernardo Galvez, also attacked British forces in West Florida as well, capturing the city of Pensacola. The Patriots' tactical successes in the West allowed the Patriots to secure the frontier from British attacks. At the same time, the fighting in the region greatly weakened Native American power, as the tribes lost valuable land, resources, and people in the fighting, all while additional white settlers poured over the Appalachian Mountains and into the territory. At the same time, another European power, the Netherlands, entered the war in favor of the United States in 1780, following Spain. The Netherlands joined the conflict on the Patriot side after John Paul Jones, an American naval commander, sought refuge in a Dutch port. The Dutch had long traded with the American Patriot colonies, becoming very rich by selling the rebellious colonists gunpowder and weapons and other goods. But when the British demanded that the Dutch turn Jones over to their troops, the Dutch refused and entered the war on the Patriot side in 1780. Now that we've discussed all of the major theaters of operations in the American Revolutionary War, New England, the Mid-Atlantic, the South, and the West, and we've discussed some of the countries that supported the Patriot cause, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, we will go back to Virginia, where the major fighting of the American Revolutionary War ended. As you remember, General Charles Cornwallis, failing to make ground in the Deep South, planned a bold assault on Virginia, where he hoped to separate General Greene's Southern Army from General Washington's Northern forces. Washington, with the advice of French commander Rochambeau, moved his army southward to confront Cornwallis in Virginia. The British High Command, under General Henry Clinton, mistook Washington's southward march for an assault on New York City and ordered Cornwallis to retreat to Yorktown on the Virginian coast, not far from the old Jamestown settlement. Yorktown was situated on a peninsula, and thus Cornwallis's army was vulnerable, being surrounded by water on 3 sides. The French Navy encircled Cornwallis and prevented his resupply and reinforcement by water. At the same time, Washington and Rochambeau's troops blocked Cornwallis on land. For over a month, the British held out, sustaining artillery bombardments from the sea and land attacks from the joint Franco-American Task Force, who encroached closer and closer to the British fortifications with each passing day. The British were finally forced to surrender on October 16, 1781, having lost over 300 KIA and 600 wounded out of their 10,000-man force. Had Cornwallis not surrendered, his troops probably would have faced death from disease, exposure, and starvation as their supplies dwindled and the winter set in Virginia. Cornwallis's surrender, which effectively destroyed the British Army's southern wing, lowered the British morale, both in the American colonies and across the Atlantic. The loss at Yorktown, though it did not officially end the war, motivated the British government to seek negotiations with the American colonies. The British and American governments began peace negotiations in early 1782. Both nations would ratify the Treaty of Paris, signed September 3, 1783, officially ending the American Revolutionary War. The Patriots, with their ragtag citizen militias and their small continental army, had survived war with Great Britain, the most powerful empire on earth, and in doing so had earned their independence. The Treaty of Paris secured the 13 colonies' independence from Great Britain. The British also ceded control of Florida, returning it to the Spanish. British property in the American colonies was to be seized by the new United States. But the treaty recommended, quote unquote, that Loyalists be allowed to keep their property or have items taken from them during the war be returned. The Treaty of Paris also mandated that both sides repatriate, return their prisoners of war, and that both Britain and the new United States would have access to the Mississippi River. Most importantly, the new United States gained control of all land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, including the hotly contested Ohio country and what is now the states of Michigan and Wisconsin, as well as part of Minnesota. When drawing up this treaty, neither side gave its Native American allies a seat at the negotiation table. The U.S.'s gain of the Midwest, what was at the time called the Northwest, would lead to a series of wars between the new nation and the various Indian tribes that called the region home. In the end, the United States' victory in the American Revolutionary War fundamentally altered and realigned the course of the Americas, and indeed the world's history. The American colonists' victory over the mighty British Empire would help to inspire other independence movements in the Americas including in Haiti in 1791, and several other Latin American nations from 1808 to 1833. The American Revolutionary War was also the beginning of the end of European colonialism in Americas, as this new conflict inspired other colonies to fight for their independence and become new nations. The American Revolution would also have profound effects across the Atlantic as well. The war would inspire the French Revolution of 1789, both ideologically and economically, as France's taxation of its people, in order to pay for their involvement in the Revolutionary War, would be a major grievance of the revolutionaries. The loss of the American colonies would also help to inspire political and social reforms within the British Empire, including Britain's banning of the slave trade in 1807 and eventual abolition of slavery in 1833. Within America, the ideals of the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, the nation's founding document, helped to inspire social changes and reforms as well. In the northern states, the ideals of the Revolution, combined with the courageous service of African American patriots, helped to bring a gradual end to slavery. Massachusetts and Pennsylvania abolished slavery in 1780, before the war had even ended. In Massachusetts, freedom for African Americans was confirmed by the case of Elizabeth Freeman, who sued for her freedom in 1781, arguing that American revolutionary ideals were inconsistent with slavery. Other states, like Connecticut, ended the institution in 1784. The new state of New Hampshire, which joined the Patriot colonies in 1776, abolished slavery in 1783. Vermont, which joined the United States in 1790, forbade slavery from the beginning. Other northern states, like New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, were slower to abolish slavery. New York passed a gradual emancipation law in 1799, which was not completed until 1827. Rhode Island, which initially forbade American slavery as a colony in 1652, did not ban human bondage again as a state until 1843. New Jersey officially ended slavery in 1846, but some enslaved people remained until 1865 and the end of the U.S. Civil War. In the South, the liberating ideals of the American Revolution threatened the institution of slavery. At the same time, however, white Southerners used revolutionary values to justify their enslavement of other human beings, particularly by claiming that the Declaration of Independence guaranteed their right to property, even human property. Some Southern colonies, like Virginia, explored the possibility of abolishing slavery as early as 1800, but these emancipation laws never passed. Slavery had made white Southern plantation owners quite wealthy, and although many of them recognized that the institution was morally wrong, they were more afraid of what would happen if they freed their enslaved people than if they kept them in chains, highlighting the white supremacist ideals of many elite white Southerners, who feared living in a society where black people would be equal to poor whites. As seen during Bacon's Rebellion, which we discussed in a previous video. Emblematic of this trend, Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, third president of the United States, and slave owner, famously said that keeping black people enslaved was like, quote-unquote, holding a wolf by the ear. Over time, as slavery died out in the northern states, it would become even more powerful in the South. But we'll discuss this development in future videos. Before we conclude our discussion of the American Revolutionary War, I want to outline the critical part that women played in the Revolution, particularly on the Patriot side. Although the American Revolution failed to extend equal rights to women, American women had nonetheless provided a central support to the Patriot cause, what many at the time called Republican motherhood. Before the fighting had even started, women had played an integral role in the boycott of British goods. Women found domestic substitutes for British goods. Instead of British tea, Patriot-minded women made tea from sassafras, likely using techniques they had learned from Native Americans. You can see sassafras root here in this slide. They also wove their own American-made cloth called linsey-woolsey, a rough but durable hybrid textile of cotton and wool. Women also organized charities and raised money to help Patriot organizations and militias. Women even protested, quote-unquote, out of doors as well, demonstrating against business owners that sold British goods or that unfairly price gouged their customers. When the fighting of the Revolutionary War began, colonial American women continued to serve the Patriot cause. Seamstresses sewed uniforms for the militiamen and the Continental Army, and Betsy Ross, a New Jerseyan upholsterer, sewed the first official Stars and Stripes, from which the modern American flag is based, with the inclusion of additional white stars to represent new states added to the Union. The red and white stripes represented the 13 states, although some later flags would add additional stripes for new states. Nowadays, the official American banner has 13 stripes only, to represent the original 13 colonies that became the states that declared independence from Great Britain. Women also served the Patriot cause in more direct ways as well. Women took care of colonial farms, homesteads, and businesses, while their men served in the militias or the Continental Army. Some women even traveled with the Patriot forces, serving as camp followers. These civilian women, as camp followers, performed critical logistical duties which, in modern wars, are generally completed by military personnel. These women foraged food and supplies, prepared meals, nursed the sick and wounded, and washed and repaired uniforms. Some women even served as sex workers, although officers tried to ban camp followers from offering this illicit service, which was considered to be immoral. Women also served as camp followers for the British and Loyalist forces as well. On the frontier, Native American women continued to serve their families and communities in much the same way they had for centuries, regardless of which faction their tribe supported, and African American women, both enslaved and free, supported their families as well. Some women even served in combat. While neither the British regulars nor the Continental Army or the militias allowed women to become soldiers in an official capacity, some women did serve in combat roles in an unofficial manner. Anne Bailey, a frontierswoman from Western Virginia, rejected colonial gender roles and joined a militia after her husband was killed by the Shawnee Indians in 1774. Bailey continued her militia service throughout the Revolutionary War, where she operated as a scout and courier for the Patriots. It's worth noting that Anne Bailey was born in Britain, and her deceased husband was actually a British soldier. So for Bailey, her service in the American Patriot militia was probably more about revenge on the Shawnee than it was about Patriot ideals. For her actions against them, the Shawnee gave her the nickname Mad Anne. The most famous woman to fight in the American Revolution was undoubtedly the legendary Molly Pitcher. Molly Pitcher was a mythic figure, and there were several American women who inspired this archetype. Scholars generally think that Mary Ludwig Hayes, a German-American colonist, was the original Molly Pitcher. Hayes was a camp follower, and her husband was a cannoneer in the Continental Army. During the Battle of Monmouth, fought in New Jersey on June 28, 1778, Mary Hayes was carrying water to the artillerymen, who used the water to keep their cannon barrels from overheating. Mary's husband fell in the battle, and she took his place, working on one of the artillery pieces. For her brave service, she received a commendation from General Washington, as attested in accounts written by veterans of the battle. Others suggest that Molly Pitcher was actually Margaret Corbin, whose artillerist husband also fell in battle in 1776, leading her to serve on his gun, just like Mary Hayes. Still others suggest that the real Molly Pitcher was a woman named Deborah Sampson, who disguised herself as a man and fought for the Continental Army. Sampson and Corbin eventually received veterans' pensions for their service, but Hayes did not. In the end, women played a critical role in the American Revolutionary War, both in its beginnings and throughout the conflict, just as African Americans and indigenous people did as well. Over the course of 8 years of fighting, between 25 and 70,000 people died in the American Revolutionary War, out of a population of about 2.5 million colonists. About 1 to 3% of the population died due to the war. In addition, 22,000 British soldiers and Loyalists died as well. The violence of the American Revolutionary War gained the 13 colonies, the new 13 United States, independence from Great Britain. Their struggle created a new nation, the United States of America, the first independent Euro-American country. The ideals of the Revolutionary War, best seen in the 1776 Declaration of Independence, would inspire other wars of independence and revolutions across the world. The ideals of the Revolutionary War would also inspire the abolition of slavery in the northern United States and Great Britain, although slavery persisted in the South after the war ended and even increased. Native Americans and African Americans took part in the war, fighting for both sides, but they were both left out of the negotiations. The rejection of Native American concerns at the Treaty of Paris would lead to future conflicts between the new United States and the indigenous peoples of the North American continent. Like African Americans and Native Americans, women played a major role in the Revolutionary War, especially on the logistical side, even though very few served in combat positions because of the gender norms of the day. All in all, the American Revolution was a significant event in world history, creating the world we know today. It also created the United States of America. We will discuss how the American nation changed over time in future videos.